Nnamdi Kanu had been in the custody of the Department of State Services for a long time. From the very beginning of his detention, the question of his health was always part of the discussion. His legal team constantly raised concerns, warning that his condition was getting worse with every passing day. They believed that the DSS facility was not the right place for him to receive the kind of medical care he needed. They argued that the treatment he was getting in custody was far below what was required for his safety. At first, their words were ignored. Whenever the lawyers brought up his health in court or through press statements, officials quickly dismissed it. The DSS repeated one thing over and over again: Nnamdi Kanu had access to doctors. They said he was receiving proper attention and there was no reason for worry. But the lawyers insisted that the truth was different. They explained that his health was fragile and that if something serious was not done, it could lead to a situation beyond repair. The more the DSS denied, the louder the lawyers cried. They went back to court, they spoke to the media, and they wrote petitions. Their message was always the same. They asked for one simple thing: transfer Nnamdi Kanu to a proper hospital where trained specialists could handle his case. They reminded the government that health is not politics, and life should not be gambled with. Every time the DSS gave their side of the story, it created confusion. Some people believed the lawyers, others believed the DSS. But one thing was clear: Nnamdi Kanu's health had become a national issue. The demand for medical treatment was no longer only about him, it was also about human rights and justice. If a man in detention could be denied proper care, then many feared what that meant for the rule of law. The lawyers refused to keep quiet. They described his situation in detail, explaining that he had certain health problems that could not be managed inside the DSS facility. They pointed out that the DSS was not a hospital, and the medical services available there were too limited. They reminded the government that specialized care is not something that can be replaced with basic treatment. As weeks turned into months, the pressure increased. The lawyers were not alone anymore. Civil society groups began to echo their demands. Human rights activists started writing statements. They asked why the government was ignoring a simple request for medical care. They said that denying proper treatment was the same as endangering his life. But the DSS continued to push back. In every official statement, they defended themselves. They said Nnamdi Kanu was being treated fairly. They said he was given access to doctors of his choice. They even claimed he was healthier than the lawyers were making it sound. Still, the lawyers stood firm. They told the government that if anything happened to him, the world would know that it was because they refused to act when they had the chance. The situation became like a battle of voices. On one side, there was the DSS, a powerful security agency, assuring everyone that nothing was wrong. On the other side, there were the lawyers, shouting that something was seriously wrong and demanding urgent attention. Between these two sides, the public was left to wonder who was telling the truth. Inside courtrooms, the lawyers kept raising the matter. They asked judges to consider his health as a matter of urgency. They begged for intervention. Sometimes, the courts listened and ordered better care. Sometimes, the courts avoided making strong rulings. Still, the lawyers never gave up. They believed that speaking out was the only way to save their client. Their cry became more desperate as they described his struggles. They said his condition was too risky to be ignored. They explained that every delay was dangerous. The DSS, however, kept giving the same answer: he is fine, he is being treated, there is no need for worry. The back and forth made many Nigerians feel uneasy. People wondered why something as basic as medical care had turned into such a long struggle. Some asked, why not simply take him to a national hospital and clear the doubts? Others asked, why was the government so stubborn about keeping him only in DSS custody? For the lawyers, it was not just about doubt, it was about life. They said health is not something to play with. They kept reminding the government that once life is lost, it cannot be replaced. They pushed their demand with courage, even though they knew they were standing against a powerful institution. The DSS, on their part, did not want to appear weak or careless. Their reputation was at stake. They wanted the public to see them as professional and capable. That was why they kept repeating their claim that Kanu had access to care. But their defense only made the lawyers more determined. The more the DSS spoke, the more the lawyers pushed back. In the middle of this clash, Nnamdi Kanu himself became the silent figure whose health was debated daily. The lawyers carried his voice, while the DSS carried their version of the story. The tension grew. The demand for medical care became a test of leadership. The question was no longer only about one man's health, but also about how the government treated people under its custody. It was in this heated atmosphere that the cries of the lawyers grew louder than ever. Their message was sharp and simple: Nnamdi Kanu must be transferred to a proper hospital. Anything less would be unfair, unjust, and dangerous. And so, the stage was set. The lawyers had made their case clear. The DSS had given their reply. The people were watching closely. Everyone waited to see if the government, and most importantly the president, would finally step in. When the pressure grew too heavy and the noise too loud, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu could no longer stay silent. For a long time, he had been receiving reports from different sides. On one side, the Department of State Services continued to insist that Nnamdi Kanu was being treated well in their custody. They said he had access to medical services and even claimed that he was doing better than his lawyers were suggesting. On the other side, his legal team was crying out again and again, warning that his health was in danger and that the only solution was to transfer him to a proper hospital. Tinubu listened carefully to both sides. He understood that the DSS wanted to protect their image. He also understood that the lawyers were not just making noise for nothing. They were worried about their client, and they wanted the world to know that his condition was serious. Tinubu knew that if he ignored the cries of the lawyers, it could create more tension, both at home and abroad. The matter was not just about health anymore. It had become a political and human rights issue. The president also thought about the weight of leadership. He understood that as the leader of the nation, every decision he made carried meaning. If he chose to ignore the cries of the lawyers, it could be seen as cruelty. If he chose to side only with the DSS, people might say he did not care about human life. Tinubu wanted to show balance. He wanted to show that his government respected the rule of law but also respected humanity. After many weeks of silence, he finally decided to speak. His words came with calmness, but they carried authority. He made it clear that he had listened long enough. He said the time for decision had come. Tinubu's voice was firm when he declared, "I have heard the repeated cries from the lawyers of Nnamdi Kanu. I have studied the reports placed before me. I have taken note of the concerns. And I have decided that for the sake of fairness, and for the sake of health and human life, Nnamdi Kanu should be transferred from the custody of the DSS to the National Hospital in Abuja. This is to ensure that he receives urgent medical attention without delay." These words carried power. They showed that Tinubu had made up his mind. For many people, it was the moment they had been waiting for. It was not only about granting the request of the lawyers but also about sending a message that no life should be put at risk under his watch. The president was careful to explain that his decision was not about politics. He said, "This matter is not about politics. This is not about party or tribe. This is about a human being who requires medical care. It is the responsibility of government to protect life. And so, I must act with that responsibility in mind." These words calmed many people. They showed that Tinubu was thinking as a father and as a leader, not just as a politician. His decision gave hope to those who believed that the government had forgotten compassion. Once his words were made public, the news spread quickly. Supporters of Nnamdi Kanu felt relief that at last something had changed. Many Nigerians, even those who did not support his politics, agreed that health is a basic right and should never be denied. The decision was seen as a step in the right direction, proof that listening to the cries of the people was still possible. Behind the scenes, arrangements were put in motion. The National Hospital in Abuja was contacted. Preparations began for the transfer. The DSS received the order from the president, and even though they had argued for months that they were capable of handling his care, they had no choice but to obey. Tinubu's word was final. The moment also showed Tinubu's style of leadership. He waited, he observed, and then he acted when he believed the time was right. Some people had criticized him for waiting too long. But when he finally spoke, his decision could not be challenged. His words settled the matter, at least for that moment. The president also used the chance to remind the nation about the importance of law and humanity. He said the strength of any country is measured not just by its security agencies or its economy but also by how it treats people in its custody. By making this statement, Tinubu made it clear that his government would not allow neglect of health to become a weapon. In the eyes of many, this decision became more than just about Nnamdi Kanu. It became a symbol of what leadership should look like. The lawyers had spoken, the DSS had defended themselves, but in the end, it was the voice of the president that gave direction. His acceptance to move Kanu to the National Hospital showed that listening to the cry of the people was not weakness. Instead, it was a sign of strength. For Nnamdi Kanu's lawyers, this was a small victory. They had been shouting for months, and finally, their cry had reached the highest office in the land. They felt relieved that their client would now have access to proper medical treatment. For them, this was proof that persistence pays. For Tinubu, it was a careful balancing act. He showed that he could listen to complaints, but he also avoided condemning the DSS directly. Instead, he framed his decision as a matter of humanity, not a matter of blame. By doing this, he gave room for everyone to save face while still doing the right thing. In the end, Tinubu's words changed the story. From that day forward, the argument was no longer whether Nnamdi Kanu should receive urgent treatment. The decision had been made, and the transfer was on its way. For once, the cries of the lawyers and the demand of the people had produced results. And so, the voice of the president became the turning point. Tinubu had spoken, and the nation listened. The DSS had no choice but to obey, and the lawyers finally saw their demand come true. A long battle of words had been answered by one simple but powerful decision: move him to the hospital now. Even after the president gave his order, the Department of State Services did not stop defending its position. From the beginning of the entire debate, the DSS had maintained the same line: Nnamdi Kanu was being cared for in their custody. They had insisted that he was not denied medical treatment. And even when President Tinubu finally accepted the request to transfer him to the National Hospital in Abuja, the DSS still wanted the world to know that they had not failed in their duty. The transfer order came as a big announcement. Many people saw it as a victory for Kanu's lawyers and as a relief for those who had worried about his health. But for the DSS, it created another challenge. If the president himself had ordered a transfer, it looked to the public as if they had failed. And the DSS did not want to carry the image of being careless with a man in their custody. So, they quickly released statements. They told Nigerians that they had always acted within the law. They reminded the public that Kanu had seen doctors while in their facility. They argued that his medical records proved he was receiving attention. To them, the transfer did not mean they were guilty of neglect. Instead, they said it was simply the president choosing to take another step. This defensive posture was not surprising. The DSS is a security institution that thrives on control, secrecy, and discipline. Admitting failure would damage their reputation. And so, they framed the transfer as a decision of the president, not as proof that they had been wrong. They kept repeating that at no time did they deny Kanu medical care. For the lawyers, these words from the DSS did not matter anymore. Their focus was on the fact that the order had been given. Their client was finally going to be seen by specialists in a proper hospital. After months of shouting, they had achieved what they wanted. Whether the DSS admitted fault or not was no longer important. The goal was that Kanu would now get urgent medical attention outside the detention walls. The public, however, continued to debate. Some believed the DSS had been hiding the truth all along and only gave in because of the president's decision. Others believed the DSS had done their best but were forced to hand him over because of the pressure surrounding the matter. The argument spread across media houses, social gatherings, and even online spaces. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Meanwhile, preparations for the transfer were quietly moving forward. The National Hospital in Abuja was informed to expect him. Security arrangements were made because of his high-profile status. The DSS, despite their defensive words, had no choice but to carry out the order. For them, obeying the president was not optional, it was final. Inside the DSS, there was likely a sense of unease. For months, they had insisted they were capable of handling Kanu's care. Now, they were being asked to hand him over. To outsiders, this looked like defeat. To insiders, It was a moment to carefully obey while still trying to protect their image. That was why they kept repeating their defense publicly. President Tinubu, on his part, did not focus on whether the DSS was right or wrong. He had already explained that his decision was guided by humanity and fairness, not politics. By framing it this way, he gave the DSS room to save face. He did not accuse them of negligence. He simply said it was the duty of government to protect life. That careful language allowed the DSS to carry out the order without looking completely defeated. For Kanu supporters, the most important thing was that he would no longer be restricted to the medical unit of the DSS. They believed that the National Hospital would provide the specialist care he needed. Many of them had long feared that his life was at risk if he remained only under the watch of the DSS. Now, with the president's order, they felt a sense of relief, even though they continued to demand more for his freedom. The DSS, however, remained firm in their narrative. They told the country that the story should not be twisted. They said the transfer was not because of failure but because of the government's desire to go beyond their efforts. They wanted Nigerians to remember that they had followed the law from the start. This tug of words created an unusual scene. On the one hand, the lawyers were celebrating a victory. On the other hand, the DSS was defending its honor. And in between, the president's decision stood as the turning point that brought the debate to action. In the bigger picture, the transfer showed the tension between security agencies and public pressure. It proved that no matter how powerful a security body might be, the cries of the people and the intervention of the president could change the course of events. It also proved that even when the DSS stood firm, their authority was not greater than that of the head of state. For ordinary Nigerians, the lesson was simple. Persistence can bring change. The lawyers had cried out for months, and at last, their voice was heard. The DSS had resisted for months, but at last, they had to comply. The president had waited, but when he finally acted, his decision carried the weight that settled the matter. And so, Nnamdi Kanu's story took a new turn. The transfer to the National Hospital was not just about health, it was about power, responsibility, and humanity. The DSS continued to defend its image, but the truth was clear: without the president's order, nothing would have changed. In the end, what mattered most was not who won the argument between the lawyers and the DSS. What mattered was that Kanu's life was given another chance through urgent medical attention. For his supporters, it was a small victory. For the DSS, it was a reminder that even the strongest institution must bow when the president speaks. And for President Tinubu, it was proof that leadership is not only about power but also about listening to the cries of the people and acting at the right time.